Great. Thanks, Ron. Appreciate the time today, everyone. My name is Bert and my background is in information security. So I'm here to talk a little bit about how we want to think about information and data security when we're talking about generative AI. Specifically, I'm going to answer some of these questions today. So when we think about generative AI, does it require me to change my approach? Do I have to do something different? Are there any mechanisms that I should be thinking about uh, to assess risk, security, and compliance requirements? And then a few examples we'll talk about as we get through the presentation. I'm going to introduce a mental model for how we think about generative AI applications. So as you saw on my intro slide, I am in the HCLS, the Healthcare Life Sciences vertical within AWS. So all of my customers are in the HCLS vertical, specifically for myself in the med devices space. I've been at AWS about 6 years, but I've actually been working in the AWS cloud for about 12 years. And as I said, with a background in information security. So the first thing I want to do today is I want to set a baseline of what generative AI is. How is AI, ML, and generative AI all related? So if we think about AI and ML, we think about how we're going to use data to predict things. So this might be forecasting sales or demand. Might be using computer vision for inspection, anomaly detection and logs, but it's predicting things based on the data. When we look at generative AI, the big difference here is now we're creating something new. It's still using data. We're still taking that data, but we want to generate new content, whether it's textual content, so draft an email or create a summary of this report or create an image based on a text prompt. So the big difference there is it's that generative or that creation capability. So you can see some different examples on there, but I wanted to, kind of set the bar as to what the difference is and why we're focusing on generative AI today. So there's been a lot of hype in the industry about generative AI. There are a few companies that are actually starting to do things in a production setting with generative AI. One I want to highlight is Gilead Sciences. If you look back at 2023, that was a time frame where a lot of my customers were experimenting with generative AI. Not too many people were doing anything in a production setting. But in late 2023, at our reInvent conference that happens in Vegas every year, Gilead Sciences presented how they've taken an example and moved it into production. And so I just want to highlight kind of what they did. They looked at how generative AI could help them with target assessment, which is a vital step in the early stage drug discovery. Right? This process involves evaluating and characterizing biological molecules such as protein and nucleic acids to determine their potential as targets for therapeutic agents. A thorough target assessment helps researchers prioritize which targets are worth pursuing for potential new medications. This is crucial as it increases the likelihood of success during drug development. However, this process can be challenging. It requires mining massive amounts of data, identifying relevant research, analyzing that research, and rapidly applying the insights gained. The sheer volume of data and the need for speed can make this a very complex and time-consuming task. Gilead looked at using generative AI and has actually rolled this out into production, including their own specialized large language model to revolutionize how they do target assessment. These systems enable their scientists to do rapid querying and analysis of vast amounts of scientific data, quickly summarize relevant research out there, simulate molecule interactions, and dynamically produce and update research reports. So this approach significantly helped Gilead Sciences increase the speed at which they can bring drugs to market. They believe that the work that they've done in this particular use case is going to not only reduce time in the target assessment phase for drug discovery, but they're looking at ways that they can reuse the lessons learned from this process, looking at the architectural patterns that were developed for this and how their large language model operations or LLM ops can be utilized in other use cases within the company to help them move faster in the industry. So as they evaluated large language models for this particular use case, security was certainly a major concern for them. But the question is, how should we be thinking about security for generative AI? Do we need a new approach when we think about generative AI and security? So if you're just starting to explore or adopt generative AI, you might imagine that a completely new discipline is required to approach generative AI security. Well, the good news here is that while there are unique security considerations, generative AI workloads are at their core just another data-driven computing workload. And they inherit much of the same security regimen that we're already familiar with. We need to remember to follow the foundational security best practices of things like observability, data governance, compliance, privacy, and user education, a major component there. So I'm going to introduce to you today a mental model for how we think about various methods in which we can consume generative AI. We're going to break the various generative AI applications down into 5 scopes in this mental model. And we're going to cover them briefly at the beginning here, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. The first scope is what I would consider a consumer-based app. So consumer apps, think about things like Amazon's Party Rock or ChatGPT, Midjourney, or Perplexity. These are consumer-facing apps. You may have, they may be free, or you may have a subscription to them, but large part, you don't have any control over the actual application. We take that to the next step, into an enterprise app. So here's where you have an enterprise agreement with some sort of SaaS provider. So think like Salesforce Einstein GPT or our own Amazon Q with AWS. We're going to start bringing in some more of that company data when we get into scope 2. Scope 3, we take that a step further. Now we're developing our own application, and we're making calls out via APIs to large language models. So if you're doing this on AWS, you might be using Amazon Bedrock to make calls to various models that are available there, or potentially talking directly to Anthropic or even OpenAI. Taking that to the next level, we get into the fine tuning of models. So here we're going to be bringing more of our own data, our own enterprise data into the model. You can do this today on AWS using Amazon Bedrock and Amazon SageMaker Jumpstart. And then finally, the last scope is where you're fully training your own large language model. So you can do this on Amazon SageMaker today, but the key thing here is it requires vast amounts of data to train complete models. So when we look at all of these, we want to think about how do we consider governance, compliance, legal, and privacy, risk management controls, and resiliency across each of these scopes. And they vary slightly as we move across these scopes. There's more detail on this particular scoping matrix in this blog that I'm referencing here, but I'm going to give you a high level during the presentation today. So first, I want to set the bar for how data flows in a generative AI application. So we start at the bottom with a user sending some input to a generative AI application. That application may or may not go retrieve some enterprise data. It is that going to send what's called a prompt, which is the input to the large language model. And it's going to send that over to either a fine-tuned model or a foundation model. And we'll see where in the scopes the difference appears. And then that large language model is going to generate a response. We call it a completion, send that back to the application, which then sends it down to the user. So that's the data flow in this whole process. And then you're going to see as I go through the different scopes, how the responsibility changes in each of these boxes. First thing I want to cover, though, is some common guidance across all the scopes. Our recommendation is don't outright ban generative AI technologies. That's akin to taking the calculators away from school when we all grew up. People are going to use them. People are going to find ways to use generative AI if you're banning it in your organization. They're going to do it on their phones. They're going to do it from home. So the better way to think about this is how can we put the right controls in place to empower our staff to take advantage of these generative AI technologies and learn from how they could improve their job or improve your company footprint, your company business by using them. So reinforce data policies. Make sure you have controls in place to monitor usage, and make sure that you have the right user education in place to know what are the proper policies for your users to be inputting data into these large language models. Compliance is a huge concern right now with generative AI. We are tracking over 1,000 AI policy initiatives globally related to AI, ML, and generative AI specifically. A lot of these are evolving on a regular basis, so we constantly need to be re-evaluating our compliance concerns with these changing standards. We have to think about data exposure and leakage. Right? Without the right security controls, is it possible that things that we're uploading into a large language model can be exposed to the outside world? We have to think about inadequate anonymization. So is any of the data that's accessible to the large language model contain private, confidential, sensitive information that needs to be adequately anonymized? We have to think about data retention and deletion policies. We all know with GDPR, you have that right to forget. Today, with a large language model, when you train it, you can't forget it unless you retrain that model. So we have to think about those things. And finally, data residency is another one that always crops up, especially around GDPR. We also have to be thinking about resilience with generative AI applications. So prompt engineering, if you've heard about some of the exploits out there where people have used prompts to make the model do things that it wasn't intended to do. Monitoring the input size, can you overrun the buffer for an input prompt? These are some things that we have to consider a little bit differently with generative AI. And for those that are familiar with the OWASP top 10 for web application vulnerabilities, that same organization, OWASP, has created a similar top 10 vulnerabilities for large language models. And I put the link here that you can reference. And it talks about some of the common exploits or attacks for large language model applications. So that's a little bit of the background on thinking about security across all generative AI applications. But let's get into the various scopes and why we're here today to talk about the different types of applications out there. So if we look at the first scope, consumer apps. So if you look at that diagram in the middle there, you'll see that most of the boxes here are purple. The purple boxes are under provider control, meaning as an enterprise, I don't have any access to affect those purple boxes. So in a consumer app, somebody else is providing the application. So if it's ChatGPT, for instance, somebody else is providing the application. I don't have any control about that. There may be some custom data that I provide, like I may upload a document and say, hey, could you summarize this document for me? But for the most part, I'm using it without any significant custom data sources. That application is calling a large language model that may be fine-tuned, it may not be. But again, it's all under the provider control. So they've brought in the data that's been used to train that model, and I have no control over that. So we have limited capabilities to think about what we can do here, but if we start looking at those 5 areas of governance and compliance, we want to understand if it's a consumer app, what are the guidelines that were used to train the models? What about the input and the output? Who owns that data? We want to be thinking about all of those and having some reporting and monitoring to understand how our enterprise staff might be using a scope 1 application. I mentioned we want to have user education, so it's good to have an acceptable use policy around generative AI. Here's a sample one. You can see the reference to teammate.vc there that this excerpt is taken from. But we all want to make sure that our users understand what they can do and with these consumer-based apps, whether they're free or whether you have a paid subscription to them. From a legal and privacy standpoint, anything that's going into a consumer-based app, I would say you want to treat that data as public data. So the prompts, what you're entering, and the responses, think about that as public. You shouldn't be putting any kind of PII confidential data into a consumer-based app. Understanding the terms of service. This is something very standard we do with looking at SaaS-based application. Who owns the data? If I'm submitting you some data, a prompt or a question, if I'm asking you to summarize a document, who owns that? Is it being saved anywhere? Is it being used to train the model? These are all things that we want to understand from a legal privacy perspective. From a risk management perspective, it's hard for a consumer app maybe to do a full vulnerability assessment, but there's certainly a risk management framework that we should be thinking about for consumer-based apps. So I encourage you to use whatever risk-based framework you have today and follow that, for generative AI applications, part of eating those security vegetables. And then from a control perspective, we don't have a lot of control in a scope one user-based application. So you have to use your standard components that you use for any other application today, things like cloud access security brokers or CASBs, web proxies, or any DLP services that you might have. And finally, from a resilience standpoint, if it's a consumer-based app, again, we don't know about the provider's infrastructure. We don't know what their resiliency capabilities are. What is their SLA? I mean, is it meet our requirements? If this is something that's business critical, you might think about how you want to implement something. If you're using a consumer-based app, maybe you want to think to the next scope where you're actually bringing it into an enterprise app. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. So let me jump into that enterprise app. So this is that scope two. So you're going to see in the diagram here that the colors are pretty much all the same, right? The scenario here is typically a SaaS-based app where you don't have a lot of control over the application. So think here like an Amazon Q or a Salesforce Einstein GPT. You don't control the application. However, there are maybe more custom data sources that will be involved here. So you might be providing data for an employee assistance, where you're going to use a retrieval augmented generation or RAG technique to read all of the employee manuals and then provide an assistant to an employee that they can ask HR related questions. So there may be more custom data sources, so you do have some control there. But for the rest of it, again, you don't have any control over the application itself or the models that it's using behind the scenes. So how does this change when we think about governance and compliance? Well, we still have the same things we had in scope one, but now we have a little bit more understanding of what's that data flow. What are those that user data that we're submitting? Does the service use this data in any other way than for our RAG or retrieval augmented generation capability that we're building in? Are there any regulatory requirements to this data? Do we have residency requirements? Do we have to make sure we run it in country? Things like that are things that we have to consider there. From a legal and privacy perspective, we add on some additional data classification requirements. What is this data that we're submitting? Is it confidential? Is it sensitive? Is it PII or PHI? Right? And I mentioned the data residency requirement there to think about. Understanding how the third party might be using that data. So we're submitting a lot more data potentially in this scope 2 enterprise application. How is that third party using that data? Do they own the data when you upload it to it? Hopefully not. What control do you have over that data? Is it used to train future models, to improve models? All these things are things that we want to understand from a risk management standpoint. So I'm going to cover just briefly some of the other scopes in the interest of time, just so you understand how things change. So when we get into that scope 3, those pre-trained models, still, we don't have a lot of control over the back-end models, but now we are controlling the application. So the big change here is in the center with the generative AI application here. We now are writing that application. So we have a little bit more control over that application. We can put some more guardrails in place, for instance, to that application and make sure that we're practicing responsible AI. And then as we move up into fine-tuned models, so now we're taking that application, we're adding some additional of our own data. So we're affecting the model. We have to look at the data that we're bringing in, the fine-tuned data. We have responsibility for that. We still don't have the responsibility for that back-end foundation model. So understanding how that foundation model was trained, the data sets it was trained on, are all still important considerations here. And finally, in that 5th scope, we control everything here. So here's where we're training our own large language model. So we're providing vast amounts of data. We're building that foundation model from scratch. We may or may not be fine-tuning it, but we're using our own application here as well. So there's a lot more detail in the blog related to the scoping matrix, but I really just wanted to introduce the scoping matrix to you today. to drive conversations around how you secure generative AI, how you provide a mental model for thinking about the different use cases with generative AI, and then a little bit more of a structured way to think about the risks associated with generative AI. Bottom line here is that generative AI is a fast evolving space. The laws, the regulations, the threats continue to evolve on a daily basis. So it really is important to pay attention to these and have regular conversations around this. So I'm going to leave you today with a few links. That first QR code there is a link to the blog that goes into much more detail about the scoping matrix. So I encourage you to go read that. And then there's a few more resources that are available to you to help with security around the concept of generative AI. So with that, I want to thank you for your time today, and I'll turn it back over to Ron.